a discussion of current events in the nation and around the world and how they affect the people of Indiana. Here's your moderator, Larry Law.
They say that when the Indiana General Assembly is in session, state bureaucrats shake in their boots, anxious for those 150 legislators to leave town. So powerful is the legislature. Whether that's true or not remains to be seen. But today we will have the legislature's most powerful man, for now, sitting in the most powerful position of the legislature. He is J. Roberts Daley, a Muncie Republican who is Speaker of the Indiana House of Representatives. We'll talk to him today about the current short session at the General Assembly. Also with us today is John Rouse, Professor of Political Science at Ball State University. Welcome, Speaker Daley. I'm going to ask you the same introductory question I asked Senator Wayne Townsend when he was on a couple of weeks ago. That is about the short session itself. It seems to me a few years ago you were an advocate of, let's either stick to what's supposed to be the agenda of the short session or do away with it. Now that you're Speaker of the House, do you have similar feelings, or is that short session being made to be a valuable session?
Oh, I think it's not overly valuable. I don't know that we ever do anything that couldn't really wait. There are a few emergency issues, but not too many really, and I think we could wait. But I'd have to be realistic and say that I don't think that's going to happen because the 150 members of the legislature enjoy trying to get their particular issues enacted, and this becomes the only forum in which they can do that. So we'd have to, by statute, change the meeting from every year to every 2 years. Now, let me just say something about that. In Kentucky, they still do meet every 2 years, but that is a misnomer, because they have all of their committee system, all of their committee work done during the interim, so that when they do meet in that every 2 year period, all of the committee work is done, and all they do is then discuss the bills as they flow. So if we did adopt, we would change it in some way, and while having almost 1,000 bills in a short session is really nonsense. Every one of the people in the House were elected from a district representing 55,000 people, and the Senate from 110,000, and they all have their own viewpoint, and no one should try to stifle them.
Some fear that as this calendar in the short session becomes longer and longer, and there's more pressure to do more things on more subjects, that perhaps this short session might become another long session. Do you see any possibility for that happening?
Well, after last session, we really did seriously sit down and take a look at how, if we meet 61 days one year and 30 the next, that's 91 days. And we tried to sit down and say, could we structure it in some better way? Maybe 50 days in the long and 40 in the short, or 45 and 45, or 46 and 45. But we never came to any real agreement. And a short session does one thing. It makes everybody act in a quick period of time. So it's kind of as broad as it is long, Larry. Those issues get squeezed out, and that's what the process is all about anyway.
Speaker Daley, if I could follow up on that kind of thinking, so far since 1816, we've had a citizen legislature. I think the salary is something like $11,600 for the year for the person serving in the House or Senate. Should we go towards a salary that is more than that, because it does take a full-time kind of schedule to be a elected politician here in Indiana?
Well, everybody does make more than that. That is the salary, but then there is a per diem, there is mileage, and so when we get down to it, except for the leadership people who spend a lot more time, such as myself, in the activity, the average legislator would make somewhere between $22,000 and $24,000 a year. Now, how you structure that you could say you get so much as a salary, period, and no per diem. Per diem is really supposed to take care of what we have to spend for our rooms and for our meals while we're in Indianapolis. And a lot of that is expense money. But in terms of income that we receive from the state for our service, it's more than twice what the figure you mentioned.
But still, that's awfully low, and it does take a lot of time. Is there any indication in the future that this salary will indeed be increased?
Oh, I have not heard any comment about that for a while. I don't think so.
If I could take you off that topic and also ask you about a couple of weeks ago, Governor Orr talked about the golden age. As Larry said, Senator Townsend was on this program a couple of weeks ago, and he talked about quality of life. What is this concept of the golden age for Indiana?
Well, I think as the governor sees it, it is tied very closely to education. The governor has really made his entire 8-year period in office one of trying to improve the quality of education for essentially public school children. I have not heard him say too much about universities, although that is part of it. But I think he believes that without an educated populace, we cannot really accomplish anything, and that we cannot have good jobs, enjoy those jobs, enjoy what the fruit of those jobs, unless we have some kind of a good education. And so I think that is what he has been, that is how he feels about that. Now, he ties that closely to economic development, which we do spend a lot of money and a lot of time in trying to see that we have a climate, an environment in which we can provide as many jobs and as much payroll for the people who live here as possible.
Well, is that not going to take more taxes?
Well, not so far.
Well, I guess the question then let's talk about education. And when you talk about education, you talk about spending money. Are funding levels adequate for public education in Indiana? And I guess an auxiliary question is, are Indiana teachers paid enough?
Well, you listen to teachers, and obviously they say they're not paid enough. And I guess from our standpoint, we have to say, how much can we afford? Teachers in Indiana, on the average, and there are about 50,000 public school teachers, on the average make around $22,000 a year, plus the fringes, which would, when you talk about pensions, vacations, and the rest of the things that are involved that most people have, it's maybe 25 to 30% on top of that. And I know that there is constant discussion as to whether that's adequate. And every time I have asked the question of a teacher or a teacher group, what do you think you should be paid? Frankly, I never get a good, solid answer. I don't know. I don't even know what they think. But I can tell you that if we increased teacher salaries substantially, let me just say that if we increased our net income tax 1%, it would raise in the neighborhood of $400 million. So if you divide 50,000 teachers into $400 million, you come out to, I'm not sure, why don't you guys tell me what that really amounts to?
Good raise, sounds like to me.
But it's a pretty good raise. But my guess is that would not really satisfy. I don't think it would. I wish I knew. I don't know what is adequate.
Well, I guess the question, and Senator Townsend brought it up, that per capita spending for education in Indiana ranks somewhere 45th or something in the nation. Is that a figure that ought to concern us?
Well, I think Larry, you're in the newspaper business, you know very good and well that if I want to prove a subject, I can skew my statistics any way I wish to prove my point. That's a point he wishes to prove. Now, I have taken a look in just the last week or so at some other dynamics and some other statistics which indicate that for the large cities in Indiana, and they name really three, Indianapolis, South Bend, and Fort Wayne, we are in the top 20 compared to the urban communities, the way they pay teachers. So we are working on that statistic and that table, and before long we will have that available. I don't think that Senator Townsend is right about that. It always amuses me how some people constantly talk about spending more money, but in 1982, when we had a crunch of revenues, none of those people who are constantly talking about spending more voted to raise more. I did.
Speaking of raising more or even less, in many states, the lottery is where they raise money for education.
True.
And don't you think that could be a very good possibility for getting everybody off the hook here in Indiana?
Well, no, I don't. First of all, I'm not sure how much money that would raise, but the best indications are that it would raise somewhere between $60 and $70 million a year. And that, of course, is a substantial amount of money. No one talks about what the costs are in raising that money or the social costs that would bring. And then there is nothing automatic about that money being spent for education. There are all kinds of special interest groups who are interested in that money being dedicated for them. If you'll notice at the last annual meeting of the Indiana Association of Cities and Towns, they went on record as favoring the lottery because they would like for that money to be used as state revenue sharing, and it all be sent back to the cities. Senior citizen groups are pushing hard for it. Mental health groups are pushing hard for it. You will find if the lottery or if legalized gambling becomes something that the state decides to engage heavily in, you will find that there will be all kinds of groups fighting for those funds. And it would be my guess that none of those funds would be dedicated. It would go into the general fund, and everybody could fight for increased funding as they do now.
Don't you think that eventually we're going to end up in the state of Indiana with a lottery?
Well, it would indicate so, yes.
I mean, that seems to be the direction things are going. And you have, like you mentioned, a long line of people who'd like to get their hands on this money.
You bet.
So
well, regardless of where the money comes from, everybody wants more money.
You know, it seems in a way that this state is really going through a reform era. I mean, in a sense, having a lottery is some kind of reform from what we've had in the past. But when you really think of reform, you think of license branch reform.
Mm-hmm.
And are we going to get true reform in this area this year?
Well, we spent a lot of time Friday debating that issue, and I guess it would depend on what someone thinks reform amounts to. If we believe that there should be no money flow from the license branch operations to a political party, then what we passed out of the House or will Tuesday is true reform, because that essentially is what that says. Now, if you believe that in addition to that we should have full disclosure as to the operation of the license branches, then I think that would be an additional plus that I could support and would support. That would be more reform. So I am very hopeful that we will get, yes, real, meaningful reform.
Is it going to cost us a lot of money? I mean, is a system a change going to mean we're spending money, or can the system be self-sustaining?
I think if the state takes it over, I think there will be substantially more costs. I think if they essentially leave the system in the hands of the private entrepreneur, but allow no funds to flow to political parties and make full disclosure, then I think essentially it will cost no more. Now, when you talk about costing more, you ought to talk about what it really does cost. When you and I go into the license branch to buy our plate, $12.50 goes to the state of Indiana for that plate. The rest of that money stays here in Delaware County, half of it for the schools and half of it for the county. You know that. That's excise taxes. But everybody perceives that that money's going to the party or to the state. That's not true. And of that $12.50, only $1.50 is retained by the branch to pay the utilities, the people, the rent, and all the rest of it. So if you're talking about it costing more, it's the $1.50 fee that might cost more. And even if it doubled, it would be $3. So you're not talking about a lot of money. I would be very hopeful that that would not occur, but I think that if we get into a situation where the state takes it over and they're required to meet all of the requirements of the building codes, and they have to pay minimum wages to people, and state wages and pensions and all the fringes, then it is going to be a more costly operation.
Isn't this part of the whole issue of the quality of life, in the sense that we should know what our public programs are doing? We ought to have a right for the State Board of Accounts to be able to go in there and tell us in terms of how the money is managed. Isn't this kind of issue a golden age kind of issue, or a quality of life kind of issue that Senator Townsend talks about?
You mean the governor?
The governor, well, of course, the governor with the concept of the golden age, and Townsend calls it the quality of life.
Oh,
isn't
whatever, it's what we ought to do.
Yeah.
Of course. I support that totally.
The issue has not been one of efficiency, right? I mean, not of operation. The one has been one of accountability, of credibility.
Right. And frankly, we were 6 years behind the Board of Accounts in terms of auditing a lot of places, mental health, mental hospitals, the universities, the cities and towns, every place that they audit. And the governor, one of the first things he did was said, you guys get over there and get those license branches caught up to date and find out what's going on. We would have never known a lot of the irregularities if the governor himself had not said, get in there and find out.
Would the governor have said that had Wayne Townsend not been pushing him?
I don't think so. I think he said that early in his first administration.
So it's not a Democratic issue, reform?
It's not a what?
It's not a issue of the Democratic Party?
Of course not. I have very few Democrats talk to me about reforming, but I have a lot of Republicans talk to me.
Speaker Daley, I believe you've been Speaker now for 6 years, and you've been in the House for 10. What do you want to be remembered for when they look back, say, in 10 years and say, Bob Daley was Speaker of the House of Representatives for 6 years or 7 years or 8 years or 10 years or whatever, and Larry Law said one day that he was one of the most powerful people in Indiana. What do you want to be remembered for?
Oh, I think that I want to be fair. I think my job is one of trying to accommodate most of the people in my house, the other 99. And I'm not interested in being a big issue-oriented person. My job is mostly being a facilitator, an administrator, trying to keep the process moving and trying to accommodate the issues and the problems that members of the House have. And I think I'm not interested in the history books. That could, that is very fleeting. And anyway, what I would like to do is be able, when I'm through, to be able, when I'm going through Rochester, Indiana, or Boonville, Indiana, that I could call my friend that I served with from those areas and say, I'm in town, can we have a cup of coffee? And they would welcome that, whether they were Democrat or Republican, and I really think that would occur.
Is that ending? So do you have any plans to retire from the General Assembly? Let's get you on the record here.
Well, not for a while. I'm still having fun.
Good. Okay. One thing I wanted to ask you, Speaker Daley, and I've covered the General Assembly as a reporter and have observed it and have some of my own thoughts on it, but you mentioned the fact that the lottery will pass one chamber and not the other, or a certain piece of legislation will pass the House, not the Senate, not the House. What is the difference in the character of these two chambers? Why is it that sometimes, even though both might be heavily Republican or never heavily Democrat, but of one political party, why is it that the character is so different that one body, one chamber will pass a bill that the other will not?
I've often wondered about that. I probably am too close to really know the answer to that. I think you must recognize there is a distinct difference in that there are 100 of us in the House and only 50 in the Senate. So from a management standpoint, it's totally different. I think that in the Senate, they spend more time discussing issues. They're longer-winded. They spend a lot more time voting. We don't spend that much time. They have fewer committees to operate, and we have more committees. And I think then something has to do with when you're representing 110,000 people, it's a different kind of a flavor than if you represent 55,000 people. So I think there is some of that involved in it.
If you were a lobbyist, and some legislators after they've retired have become that, even ex-speakers, as a matter of fact.
Not me.
Not you, okay, that's on the record.
I don't want to do that.
We've got that on the record too, okay. If you were a lobbyist, would you take your bill to the Senate before you take it to the House?
Yeah, I think I probably would. It seems to me that Senate bills fare better in the House than House bills do in the Senate.
Speaking of...
I haven't looked at the statistics. That's very interesting. I'm going to take a look at that. I haven't done that yet.
Let me know what you find out.
Yeah, I will.
Okay. Speaking of bills in both the Senate and the House, Ball State University has, in the last several years, talked about an academy for the gifted student, focusing upon things like science and math and humanities. How is that progress going on?
Well, there were identical bills introduced in the House and the Senate, and that is a strategy that the people who are interested in that, the Ball State University people, decided to begin it in both directions and try to move it and see what happens. And it's a good thing they did. They, from a strategy standpoint, they played it right, because in the Senate committee, it was voted out of committee and probably is going to be voted out of the House. In the House committee, it did not get out of committee because it was tabled. Now that bill is in the Senate and will come to the House if it does get through, and I'm not exactly sure how that will fare. I think one of my jobs, Larry, also is to be consistent. A number of people say to me, "Oh, Mr. Speaker, why don't you be fair? Put my bill in some other committee." Well, what they mean is put that in another committee where the bill will come out. Fair to them means favorable. It doesn't. But I have resisted that. I think that I avoid an awful lot of controversy if I try to be consistent. And I think that's important that I do that. And that is an interesting philosophical issue as to whether Indiana, as a public policy, is going to have an an academy for 300 11th and 12th graders that will leave their homes and their schools and come to some university campus, preferably, hopefully, Ball State, and for a specialized, highly disciplined program that would have, well, not disciplined maybe, but be very, very involved in an honors type program in those subjects. I have been to North Carolina, where they have had now for 3 or 4 years one of these, and they have produced some really stunning results. But there are other issues on the other side. Should we spend that much money for 300 kids, or should we spread it and keep it where we have for all of the children, the 930,000 public school children in Indiana?
We were writing history here earlier over the personal history of J. Roberts Daly in the legislature. Let's talk about this session. When we look back on this session, what is the 1986 short session going to be known for, except perhaps for its brevity?
Well, license branch reform, I hope, and I would say that would be the most visible issue that comes through this session.
What else do you expect coming through this session of note?
Oh, I think not today, but tomorrow we'll have over 100 bills on second reading. Friday we defeated 2 bills that had to do with smoking and cigarettes. One had to do with fair trading, and the other had to do with smoking in public places, and the lobbying was effective enough to beat both of those. That received an awful lot of attention. The revenues of the state are down somewhat, so there really is not going to be very much more money appropriated. We appropriated a $15.2 billion biennial budget last year, so my guess is money is not a major issue.
Okay, well, one last yes or no question. Is the lottery going to go through this session?
I don't know.
That wasn't yes or no. Thanks to our guest today, House Speaker J. Roberts Daly, and thanks to John Rouse from Political Science for being with us. I'm Larry Law. Thank you for joining us. Okay.
If you have comments regarding this program, please address them to John Rouse, Box 149, Muncie, Indiana 47305. The producer for Public Affairs Roundtable is John Rouse. Associate producers are Cecil Bohannon and Bill Mosier. This program is a production of University Media Services, the Department of Political Science, and radio and television stations on the campus of Ball State University.